The ceasefire declared in February has failed to stop the fighting between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Now the United States is sending military equipment to the Baltics on behalf of NATO allies. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. More than 6,500 people have been killed in eastern Ukraine since the fighting began last year. Pro-Russian fighters now control large portions of two eastern regions following Russia's absorption of the Crimean Peninsula. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is warning that the situation is deteriorating. CCTV's John Gilmore reports.
Soldiers on patrol in eastern Ukraine find only burned-out buildings and homes in a village outside the port city of Mariupol. The area has been a strategic battleground for Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian fighters over the last 15 months. The fighting has been nearly constant in eastern Ukraine since a ceasefire agreement was signed in Minsk in February by leaders from Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany. The United States and the European Union have continued to pressure Russia with numerous economic sanctions.
We will keep up the sanctions until the day the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreement is fully implemented and other international commitments are upheld.
In Moscow Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the sanctions a punishment by the West because it has an independent foreign policy, a sentiment echoed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov during a recent press conference.
The European Union have not voiced any demands for Kiev to implement the Minsk agreements, even though the vast majority of provisions in that document suggest proactive steps by the Kiev authorities. Then we have a paradox here. The more actively Kiev is torpedoing the Minsk agreements, and they are torpedoing them with vigor, the more blame is laid upon the Russian Federation for that.
The United States is sending tanks, heavy artillery, and other equipment to countries across the Baltic to bolster their security. Defense Secretary Ash Carter says the U.S. wants to deter Russia from attempting another incursion within the region.
And we each agreed that while we do not seek a cold, let alone a hot war with Russia, we will defend our allies, the rule-based international order, and the positive future it affords us all.
The equipment is headed to temporary storage sites in 6 countries, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. It will be used by U.S. troops for a series of exercises in the region. Russian President Vladimir Putin called the actions by NATO Cold War-style provocations and separately has announced a boost to its nuclear arsenal.
This year, the size of our nuclear forces will increase by over 40 new intercontinental ballistic missiles that will be able to overcome even the most technologically advanced missile defense systems.
Meanwhile, the United Nations reports more than 1 million people have been displaced by the fighting. John Gilmore, CCTV.
Joining us now from New York is Yuriy Sergeyev. He is the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us. Are things deteriorating as we speak in Ukraine? There seems to be on both sides pressure to actually scrap the Minsk agreement just signed but not implemented a few months ago.
Yeah, unfortunately, the situation is looks like you said, the deteriorating is continuing. Since February 12, after the new arrangements, we lost more than 450 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers killed, and 2,500 wounded. So no ceasefire is observed by the OSCE, unfortunately.
Why is that? Why hasn't the ceasefire held on both sides?
So Russia is using this situation to keep the tension on that part of Ukraine and using it as the for the pressure during different meetings in different formats, in normative format and trilateral group. By the way, today when we are speaking with you, the new meeting of the trilateral group is being held in Minsk. And so this situation is being used by the people from the region to press my capital to follow their demands, not as we agreed upon in September and then in February. This is for that purpose.
You know, Russia has long denied that it's backing pro-separatist rebels in the east of the country. What's your evidence that they are?
Except Russia, the whole world around have a lot of the evidences that Russia keeps bringing in weaponry, supports the mercenaries, volunteers who are coming, and financing. This is the reason why the European Union and many capitals, they introduce sanctions against Russia. Russia denies its involvement despite the evident fact, despite the detention of many regular officers and soldiers from their army who are participating in these in the combats on the east of Ukraine. So this is the tactics, unfortunately.
And what about Kiev? Kiev is not necessarily blameless in this, because in the Minsk agreements, for example, there was much needed devolution of federal structure. Sometimes the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev hasn't acted on that. Is that correct?
No, it's not so correct, because we never spoke about the federalization of Ukraine because it's contrary to the constitution. We reject it immediately. In Minsk agreements, now what is provisioned? Decentralization. Decentralization doesn't mean federalization. Federalization is what Moscow demands and push their puppets in the eastern part of Ukraine. They need to have controlled regime there. Federalization gives them these mechanisms. So we are not ready for federalism, because federalism needs the stability. Federalism needs the democratization of the whole Ukraine. So nothing wrong in the federalism. Look at Germany, for example, but we are not ready for that. That's why we proposed decentralization not only for this region, but the whole Ukraine. So, and it will be implemented.
The European Union and the United States have imposed sanctions on Russia since the Crimea and also Ukraine crisis began. But they've just voted to extend those sanctions, but Russia doesn't seem to be reversing any sort of policy. Why do you think that is? Do you think the Europeans should be tougher?
I'm convinced that the world around, and Europe particularly, should understand that what is going on in Ukraine, it is not only about Ukraine, it's about Europe. It's even beyond the Europe. So because Russia keeps demonstrating the continuity of the Soviet aggressiveness, what we observed in the past is being performed today. They are to stop Russia now, because the problem will be expanded to other territories. For example, Baltics, as Moscow repeatedly stated several times, threatening the broader territories, not only Ukraine.
Well, we've seen NATO actually reinforce troop levels in the Baltic states, promise more if need be as well. Is that stepping up the division that we're seeing in Europe, a new Cold War between the West and Russia?
Well, this is not a fortunate perspective, but Russia is pushing the world in that direction. They are isolating themselves. This is a pity, but this is the way they are providing their policy. The Baltic states, they have been threatened. Baltic states are members of the NATO, and they have a full right to address NATO to defend them. So, but it is not the reason which NATO produced themselves. This is the reason caused by Russian aggressiveness.
So Ukraine, of course, not a member of NATO, not a member of the European Union yet. Are you still going to go forward on that track, given the fact that the whole debate about Ukraine's place in Europe kind of led to where we are right now?
Ukraine is in a very challenging geostrategic situation. That's why we need to find the comfort for our safety and security. We do understand that NATO perspectives are a miracle because of the position not only of Russia, who is pressing, but a position of some European countries. What we need to do, instead of demanding the NATO membership today, to make reforms in our safety and security sector, to make us stronger, to be ready to defend. We have already demonstrated this readiness to defend. We stopped aggressor now there, but unfortunately NATO is not helpful directly. They could help indirectly when they demonstrate the unity to stop the aggressor.
So you want more weapons? You want more weapons and more expertise from NATO?
We need some kind of weapons. We have our own. We have weapons. We have some. We need some technologies to resist this hybrid type of the aggressiveness. So not only from NATO. The Article 51st of United Nations Charter gives out this opportunity to address anybody in the world beyond NATO, what we are doing.
Right.
And so we have the support.
So I'm just trying to square this. So you're asking for more military equipment, but in the Minsk agreement, it's all about de-escalation. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, from the building you're sitting in, called for a de-escalation. Wouldn't that run counter to that? And how do we get back on track to this Minsk idea of lessening the tensions?
Two angles of that question. First of all, we never built our army to defend ourselves. Despite the fact that Ukraine is in the 10 countries big producers of weaponry, we never invested in our army. And now, understanding that nobody will come to defend us, we need to have a strong army for the defense purposes, doing ourselves and with the assistance of our partners. Second, yes, de-escalation. De-escalation is the not unicide approach. Those who signed the Minsk agreements, Russia is the signatory party of that, should respect their commitments not to supply weaponry to the militants in the eastern part of Ukraine, not to support terrorists and mercenaries there. Ban Ki-moon, many times he addressed all the parties for de-escalation and so on. Unfortunately, the role of United Nations is not so strong as it could be because of the limits within the Security Council, with some limits in the General Assembly, and the limits of the action from the Secretary General. United Nations and the Secretary General should understand that it is not about Ukraine. This is about the entire world, because the basic principles of the United Nations have been destroyed.
Yuriy Sergeyev, Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations, thanks for joining us. Now we're going to take a break. Next, we'll bring you the Russian perspective on the unrest in Ukraine. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.